Good evening, everyone.
What's that?
Welcome. Happy Election Day. Thank you for all being here. We're excited to have a lot of students. Thanks for being here for our Encountering Christ Through Service event. This is part of a semester-long theme of events on handing on the faith, sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Center. But tonight we're co-sponsoring that, and we want to say thank you to our co-sponsors, the Volunteer and Service Learning Center and Campus Ministry. As many of you know, direct service is key to our faith formation, especially for young people, especially for you, for growing up. These are the moments that are most formative in our faith and in our identity. Tonight, we have an incredible panel led by Dan Ponsetto, the director of the BC Volunteer and Service Learning Center. Many of you know some of our panelists. We have Steve Pope, professor in BC Theology Department, Mary Lubaza, director of Confirmation and Youth Ministry at Good Shepherd Parish in Wayland, Gisela Mendizabal, the family advocate at Horizons for Homeless Children in Boston. And you can read more about, maybe you grabbed the one pager as you came in that has more about their bios. So what we'll do is Dan and the panel will have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up and welcome your thoughts and comments or questions, and then we'll be out of here around 6:30 so you can vote or do whatever else you do on election night. So without delaying any more, I turn it over to Dan. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Church 21st Century and to our panel for tonight, and thanks for coming out tonight. It is election night, and I haven't voted, so I'm going to make sure that we wrap up by 6:30 so I can race home and do that. So the title again is Encountering Christ Through Service, and I thought I'd just make a couple comments and then begin to ask some questions and open it up for our panel. The first comment is this, is that at a place like Boston College, and I suspect for some of you also who work in parishes or in communities here in the Boston area or beyond, we do quite a bit of service. Our students are very interested in serving and engaging in different types of ways in the Boston area and beyond, domestically and internationally. And from my perspective, and I think from a shared perspective here at Boston College, we do that for a couple of reasons. Primarily, we don't do it to change the world. It'd be nice if we could change the world, and we hope that there's some change in some lives. But really, the primary reason we engage and commit ourselves to this work is in the hope that some learning will take place, that really a transformation takes place for those people who are doing the service, and that there's a discovery when entering into a relationship with another person, with a young person or an older person or with a community of persons. There's a discovery of a capacity for greater empathy, for greater compassion. There's a discovery of a way, of a path forward, maybe of discerning a vocation, a way of thinking about one's gifts and talents, what one is passionate about. And then ultimately, too, there's this possibility that a paradigm might shift a bit, a paradigm of understanding their own life, a paradigm of the world, of citizenship in the United States, and even a paradigm of God, and a new way of thinking about who God is, whether God is, and how we're related to God. The second thought is this. The title is Encountering Christ Through Service, so that implies that there's a natural relationship between conversion to and a relationship with Jesus Christ and the act of serving or of being a servant, that somehow there's a relationship between those two. And I wonder, I'm hoping that tonight some of the conversation might get us thinking a little bit about this question, and that is, do we serve because we're followers of Jesus, or do we become followers of Jesus through our service and through our experiences of some of those relationships and that transformation that can take place? I suspect that we each have a different story related to that. Some of us might say the former, and some might say it's more the second, that really it was through some experiences of service that we came into this relationship. A few scriptures that I was thinking of in preparing for this that I'll share with you. When I think of this idea of encountering Christ and the call to be a servant, I think of Matthew 25. That idea of whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did it to me or for me. And I think of Mother Teresa and her constant claim to be able to see the face of Christ in the poor and the dying on the streets of Calcutta, that there was a physical manifestation of Jesus in her midst. I think of John 13, in the moments before Jesus' arrest, he washes his disciples' feet as a great act of service and says, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. No servant is greater than his master. I think of Mark 10, James and John arguing and jockeying for a greater position in the kingdom of God, hoping that Jesus will promise them that when he comes into his kingdom, you'll let one sit on the left and one sit on the right. And Jesus comes back at them and says, contrast the measure of greatness. The measure of greatness, as is understood by the leaders of the time, is contrasted with his vision when he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave of all. Very counter to what most of us think. And last, I think of Philippians 2. And Paul, quoting from an early hymn to Christ, he says that our attitude must be the same as that of Christ Jesus, quote, who being in very nature God, did not cling to his prerogatives as God's equal, but emptied himself, taking the very nature of a servant. I was going to go on and keep reading, but I'm going to stop there and begin to and ask our panel to get involved here. And I want to start with a general question, and the general question is this, and any of you can answer this question. First of all, how do you think of or define service? And who are the models you would point to that helped you form that definition?
Sure, I can start. When I think of service, I think of faith does action or faith in action. So the idea of being in solidarity with those who I serve, like working together for a better life, maybe the idea of like bringing the kingdom of God alive. And I think for me, it was definitely the way I was handed on the faith. I was handed a faith that did justice. So my mother understood her work as a doctor as her vocation, and it was no longer a disparity between what does it mean to be a faithful follower of Christ and what does it mean to serve. It was like they both went together. So that's kind of like the faith that I was handed.
I don't think we can define service first. I think we can describe it. And the term that comes to my mind is availability. Because I think it's easy for us, especially as Americans, because we're pragmatic, we're action-oriented, we like to see results. It's easy for us to do things for other people. And when we do things for other people, it's our agency, our power, that in a small way, it gets reinforced and gets the attention. And it can, I'm not against doing things for people, but it can be done in such a way that it just leaves us as we are and gives us a feeling we're making a difference, so it inflates our ego. And then we become the center and not the other person or the community. And I think of availability is allowing yourself to be open to the reality of the other, not getting your agenda projected onto them, not allowing your fears to control the way you're perceiving that person, not allowing your prejudices to lead you to be judgmental or to try to fix somebody. I don't think service is about fixing people. I think service is about loving people. And loving at its core has to be about affirming their worth as human beings, first and foremost, always, beginning and end. How do I see the sacredness of another person? And then how do I act in a way that's appropriate to that sacredness? I really think that's what Jesus did. he didn't allow all the stuff people put on other people to get in the way of him loving them. And I really think that's why he got crucified, because he broke through all the barriers that people set up to reinforce their own power. What do you think?
Well, you took my answer.
Oh, sorry.
Just kidding.
You've got your notes, and I'm really good at cheating, because
Yeah,
a
you did.
professor of ethics, I couldn't help it.
Yeah. Or you maybe taught me some of this, but when I was thinking about it too, I had trouble defining service, but I came up with a similar definition. Maybe you would disagree, but I said it's a willingness or a disposition to try to move beyond ourselves and share ourselves, and being open to the experiences and needs and perspective of other people, and the ways that these experiences and encounters might change us and shape who we are. And also service is a way of coming to know Christ in the world, and also learning how to be Christ in the world. So at the end of it, I came up with a similar definition, which is it's a way of trying to love God and be loved by God in the world. And so, and maybe like Gisela too, my model of service came from my parents, who saw their lives as service. So everything that they did, how they used their time, how they spent their money, how they interacted with the person that they met on the street, was always a way of trying to encounter Christ. And so I was lucky to have that model. And I've met a lot of other people along the way who have taught me different ways of doing that, different ways of being open to God acting in that way through the world.
So my second question is a little bit related to this, and it has to do with your experience. And my question is, can you think of a time in your own life when you've been, first of all, I think that sometimes we make a mistake and service becomes an extraordinary thing in our lives. So we live our normal lives 99% of the time, and then 1% of our life is spent doing some service somewhere. And we fail to see all of life as an opportunity to serve. I often tell my class that it doesn't matter if I'm great at, or I get paid at Boston College to be the director of the Volunteer and Service Learning Center. So you must think I'm great at doing this. My daughter's here in the crowd. I won't point her out, but she could tell you that I can be a real pain in the butt at home. So it doesn't matter if I'm doing this, professionally, if I'm not living that out with the people that I love the most. My question was going to be, when you're in service, or when you've, maybe not extraordinary, just in trying to be a servant to other people, have you had memorable times in that experience where you've had a bit of an aha moment, where when we're thinking about this relationship with God, where you've learned something or your relationship has deepened as a result of the encounter with the person that you're supposedly serving or accompanying, and you could think of a time specifically where you've had deepening moments in your relationship with Christ? That's open to any one of you.
You wanna go? I think I was studying social work here, so I just graduated, and it was my first semester, and I'm going as an intern, and you don't know many things. You haven't learned how you're supposed to do anything. And I come to this client I'm doing a therapeutic mentor, and I go to the house, and this is this child. She's in foster care, and she's dysregulated, so she's really having a hard time, and the foster mother doesn't tell me, she just leaves. So I walk in, and I'm supposed to solve this, and I just walk into this child, she's just really struggling, and she's throwing everything. You may think she's 13, but she really is, at that point, probably a 3-year-old that's tantruming and throwing everything. And I have no idea what am I supposed to do. No class ever told me what I'm supposed to do. I'm just me and this child in the class, in this house. And I just sat there. Because she was so dysregulated. I had no idea what to do. So I just sat there in her bed, and I just prayed. I had no clue what I was supposed to do. No idea. Nobody told me how you de-escalate the situation or anything. So I just sat there. And I was well, it seems to me that I'm alone, but I'm not. God, come be with me, because I have no clue what I'm supposed to do. I just sat there. And she's picking up things. She's saying things that she's going to throw things away. And I just sat there. I just sat there for a while. And somehow she calmed down. She calmed down after, I think it was half an hour that we sat there. And she finally calmed down. And we go on our visit. and we talked about it. But I was just like, oh, it's just another moment. It's not a big deal. Like, you just sit there and these things happen. And I talked to my supervisor, who's really wonderful. And she's just asking me, so what kept you from like trying to do something or fix the situation or do it? And I was like, I was just not alone. To me, I wasn't alone. Like, God was with me. I had no clue what was the proper way. And I think of several moments of encounters or places or times when no matter how many education you've gotten, no matter how many techniques you know, there are just some situations where we just don't know what to do. And just being in presence with another is the best we can. But understanding that we're not alone and that we have a companion that's doing it with us and being with us and with the person. And it was powerful. It was a really powerful thing for me. And as I've gone on through my work, I just make sure that before I go and encounter another person, I remember that I'm not myself, like, alone, and I bring God along with me. So I think that was powerful for me.
You don't have to answer all these questions. You can think of it on.
I'll go. I have a. Then you go next. Okay. I'll kind of crowd you out. But I remember as a junior in college, I was studying philosophy. I had gotten the bug, and I became kind of a maniac about philosophy. And I volunteered with the school I went, Gonzaga University, in the Peace and Justice Center. What we did, we were doing tutoring, or kind of religious education in a home for people with mental disabilities. And so we were going regularly tutoring, or being with people, reading to them in a home for people with Down syndrome. And I remember going on Good Friday once, and I had a course on New Testament. I knew the Passion of Mark, the Passion of Luke, the Passion of Matthew and John, and how they're different and what their origins were. I had been studying it very intensely, and I thought I was really very knowledgeable. Looking back, I didn't know very much, but I was all excited. And we go to the home, and we're going to read the Passion of Mark. And we start reading it, and I'm analyzing as the words are being read about Jesus' arrest. And I'm thinking, what kind of a trial, what would this have looked like? What was the trial like? What were the charges against him? What was the evidence? And as things are going slowly, and one of the girls, she was 16 years old, a person affected by Downs, but she was reading the Passion story. And she was reading it kind of slowly, so that sort of slowed me down. And I noticed, as she was reading the story, she was starting to cry. And I went, whoa. It just kind of like, aha. And as she was reading the story, she just stayed with it. She got into a flow and was reading about Jesus being arrested, and then about Jesus' friends running away, and Jesus being whipped. And as she was reading this, she wasn't weeping, but these big tears were coming out of her eyes, and she was there. It was like she was feeling it so powerfully that she was in the moment. And I realized, with all my books and my synoptic gospel theories and my courses and my reading, I was a million miles away from Christ, and she was right there with Christ because she was available. She was allowing it to hit her. And I realized that I had gone there to serve her and her friends. And in fact, I was the one who was being served. I was the one who was being led into Christ by the person that I thought I was going to help. And it's as I'm saying that, my heart's beating right now because it was such a powerful experience. It was an experience of humility and of recognizing the truth of the gospel, that it's the little ones, it's the simple, it's the people that are poor that show us who Christ is, and not us when we're arrogant and being hyper-intellectual or pretending to be an intellectual, and not us when we're showing off, but really when we're open and we're quiet. The Spirit works through people when we don't expect it. And so much of the gospel's that way, right?
Thank you, Steve. Do you want to add anything?
Sure. Well, I had a story too. The same one as his. Just kidding. I was, something that you said in the introduction to this question about how when we are working in a field, so I'm currently a youth minister and director of confirmation, so people think I do all of this wonderful work. Some people do, some people think it's strange, but a lot of it's paperwork, a lot of it's emails, and so after a few months of doing that, I realized that I needed to be outside of this bubble of the town where I work. And so I started going back to Haley House, which is probably many of you are familiar. I recognize a face from there here today. It's a soup kitchen and all sorts of other things, and I was very involved when I was a student here at BC. And so I started going back there in the morning to help with the shift, and it's a really neat place because it's a place where there's a lot less boundaries between those who are being served and those who are serving. So there's a lot of people who kind of cross between the kitchen and the place where people eat food, and those who come specifically to help prepare the food also always eat with the people who are there, who are less resourced. And so there's almost every time I go, I am broken out of myself and my own kind of bubble, and Christ speaks to me. I mean, that sounds a little odd, but I do find myself being completely, my perspective being shaken up. And a specific example is a few weeks ago, I was actually really tired and really dragging when I went there, and I had been dragging in my daily life. I had been tired with work. There was just a lot of things going on. And we made the food, and then I went and sat next to a man who had already been kind of making a bit of a ruckus. He was pretty drunk and belligerent that morning, and Haley House doesn't necessarily say you can't be there if you are in that state. And I, by chance, kind of sat next to him, and he smelled pretty terrible and was not being nice to people. But I sat down next to him, and it wasn't because I was a great Christian. It just I happened to sit next to him. And I started talking to him, and he wasn't really making a lot of sense at the beginning of the conversation. And then he said something that totally stopped me in my tracks, and he said, "What do you do for work?" And I told him I work at a church, and he asked me, because he had that opening of talking about God, he said, "Do you wake up every morning and get on your knees and thank God for this day? Because that's the most important thing you can do." He just said that clear as day, and I wasn't even as articulate as he was. This is a man who had previously not been making any sense, and it stopped me in my track because at that point, I hadn't been doing that. I hadn't been grateful for my life. I had been kind of tired of the day in and day out of what ministry sometimes is, which is just logistics. And so right there, I found that it was Christ speaking to me and saying, thank God for your life. And this man was able to show me that in a way that I hadn't been able to see otherwise.
Thank you. I'm going to keep us moving along, and I'm going to keep you going, Mary Lou, okay? And I'm going to ask some specific questions for the three of you. Mary Lou, you're working in parish work now, and Mary Lou's done a lot of different things. She's been in campus ministry work. She's worked internationally in Central America. She's taught. But now you're in parish ministry, and I want to ask the question of how service is related to your ministry and kind of the goals of youth formation. So my question is, what are you learning? I know you've only been there for a year and a half, but that's a good time to learn. And so in your first year and a half, what have you been learning about young people and faith formation as it relates to service and the role service plays in parish work?
I know that service is something that they're often interested in. So from when I started at the parish, people say, oh, the kids really want to do service. But I think one thing that has been difficult is how busy young adults are. So specifically, I'm talking about high school kids. It's part of our culture, though, everywhere you go. And so I think it's a challenge to get kids to be able to be engaged in service, however you define it, to be open to the experiences that are going to transform them, which I think are not often just making a care package, which is something that we do, and it's a great opportunity. It's a service opportunity. But a challenge is to really help find ways for the kids to grow in relationships and to be open to the ways that they can be transformed in settings that are not part of their comfort zones. But I do think that for especially high school kids who are especially in their own bubbles, no matter what their socioeconomic situation, it's hard for them to sometimes see outside of the politics of what goes on. Maybe politics isn't the right word, but the interactions that they have on a social level in high school. But I do think that opportunities for service, opportunities to go beyond the people that they will meet in their everyday life really do change them and allow them to see that the Gospels are true and the Gospel's stories make sense, and that Jesus is really someone with whom they can have a relationship and someone who can change their existence, can help them to have a different perspective on the world.
Thank you.
Answer the question, Dan?
Well, they did answer, and I think that it's important. You talked about the way in which they understand the gospel and see Jesus, and I think so often most of our young people, maybe many Catholics in this country, develop a relationship with the church and have an idea of what church is and what the church is, and that service can become an opportunity of getting outside of whatever that image is and experience what it means to be church in mission and what it means to live out our faith. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'm going to ask specific questions for these two talented guests as well. So, Steve, I'd like you to comment, if you would, as a theologian, how you understand this idea of what it means to serve others in terms of being converted to Christ or following Jesus. Where does that fit in there?
That's a good question. Depends on what you mean by conversion, and depends on what you mean by Christ. So it's not like Bill Clinton. So it depends on the meaning of the word is. But I'd say there are many paths to Christ as there are individual life stories. But I think nowadays, oftentimes you hear people talk about Christian faith as explicitly believing in Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. And I'm all in favor of that. That is, having Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, especially the Savior part. But oftentimes it becomes a matter of believing certain things and going to church, and it's too much to me in the head and not enough in the heart and not enough in life. And I actually think the journey from going from your head to your heart to action is really hard to take. And maybe this is just my own personal experience, but I think it's much more helpful. To me, it's more fruitful to move from action to the heart to the head. I think that path is what is opened up by service. Because in serving, first of all, I think we start to understand concretely what it means to love the neighbor and what it means to be loved by the neighbor. And in understanding that in a very experiential way, it has to affect the heart. And I think ultimately, the only things that count in your head are what are first in your heart. We're very good at rationalizing, at spinning out theories. I'm saying this as a professor. I make a living doing it. And I also say that as beautiful and important as the life of the mind is, the life of the mind without the heart is sterile. And I'm not anti-intellectual, but I think the path to Christ is, again, it's varied and unique, but I think the people I've seen that have been the most transformed in their lives on a path of faith have first found Christ in a very practical way in their lives, by people, through people, in people. And then their challenge is, how can I internalize this? How can I appropriate it? How can I say, how can I say yes to that and make it part of my life? And then after I've done that, how do I think about the life I'm living? How do I reflect on my experience affectively and my experience practically? I can give you a little example. When I was, after college, I taught high school for 3 years. And I took juniors and seniors in high school to the Catholic Worker in Soup Kitchen in Los Angeles. There was a kid in our group who was very cool. He was kind of like the captain of the football team and the surfer kind of guy together. So he was a very confident person on the surface. And he decided he'd want to go have an experience, so he went with us down to the Soup Kitchen in LA, from Anaheim, California, which is a nice middle-class area. He goes the first day, and he goes, that was really more interesting than I thought it would be. I want to go back. And he started talking about the guys and their problems and living on the street and starting to imagine what it would be like to be those guys. So his imagination was affected by the experience. And he went back another time. And long story short, after about 2 months, we were there, got there at 6 o'clock in the morning, got out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon after cleanup. And he goes out to his car, and he had a really nice car. I was a teacher, and I was coveting his car as a high school kid. It was really nice. It was like a convertible, Mustang convertible, something really cool. And I was a bachelor, so I was really wanting that car. Anyway, we go out to his car, and somebody had taken a brick and smashed in the side window and stolen stuff outside of his car, stole his radio, and took sweaters and stuff that were in the car. And when we started working there, he would be like the kind of guy that would go by and rub a little bit of scratch off the car. He looked at the smashed up window and the damaged car, and he said, "It's not a big deal." His friends were all freaking out. He goes, "It's not a big deal. It's just a car. It's just a thing. It doesn't matter." What I found in that soup kitchen is worth a lot more than what was taken out of this car, and I'm going to come back next week too. What changed in him was his experience of love in the soup kitchen, not his experience of being loved, but really primarily his experience of coming to love the guys that beforehand he had considered lowlives. He considered to be useless. He was raised to think they don't count as human beings. And the fact that they were living their lives under the conditions they were living, their lives were so terrible, he couldn't be bothered with his car. Now, I didn't say to him, "So now you love Jesus, right?" I didn't need to, because I see concretely he's coming closer to Christ, because he's coming closer to love. Last point about that story is his attitude to the church also changed. He had looked at the church as an institution with rulers, with leaders that were teaching rules and enforcing the rules. And in seeing Christ in a new way, he also saw the church in a new way. He started really seeing the church as a community of people, and in fact, not a community of other people, but a community of which I'm a part. And instead of blaming the hierarchy or getting angry at a priest or Monsignor for giving a bad homily, he was looking at, how can I be more Christ-like? How can I be a better Catholic in his case? So he took ownership. I think that's a conversion. And it was a very powerful one.
Speaks to what you were all sharing a little bit earlier about how those who we go to serve, the poor, the handicapped, the homeless, become our educators, become our teachers, and the experience that he had, and that experience opened up some new things for his life. Gisela, you work with Horizons for Homeless Children, and have been a student here at Boston College, and was a peer minister here, and now you find yourself working with homeless families and their children. How would you talk about, in a non-faith-based type of work? I mean, it's very faithful work, motivated by faith. Can you talk about that? How do you see your faith and your relationship with God in terms of animating your vocation and working where you do?
I think for me, it's about like what's the motivation. And so even though I'm in a place where we don't particularly talk about what is our faith, like all of us are there because we care about the children. And so at the end of the day, I'm able to talk to all of my coworkers because we may have a lot of arguments about different things, but when it comes down to it, we all care about the children. I think how my faith informs my work, it really requires me to be very attentive. Like it's not a matter of going through the day and doing my work, then God is not a part of it. I think for me, it has been about creating ways in which I can be more reflective and open within my work to see Christ in it. And so it's helped me because I need to be humble. Like, as much as I've learned all these theories and social work classes, et cetera, at the end of the day, I'm not God, and it's really wonderful that I am not because I don't have to save everybody, but I can do my piece and I can do it good, and at the end of the day, I can be fine with that. I'm like, I did my part, and that is okay. And I don't have to come home with the burden of all of my families because next day, they will still be there. And so I do my work, I am there the whole time, I am 100% present, but when I go home, I take time to honor my own self, to re-energize myself so I can go the next day and be okay with that. And that's something that I talked to my director a while. How do we talk to our coworkers that I want to stay there all the time and work extra? It's really understanding that we are not the saviors. And that for me, believing in God gives me comfort. And so that's really important. And the other piece in social work, we talk about strengths-based approach. And it's basically whenever you encounter somebody, you just really believe that this person is doing the best they can in their situation. And so encountering the people that I serve in that way, like even though it may seem that things are not going well and people may be frustrated, really going around, and I'm not saying to my coworkers or to the people, it's God, but to me, that's how God looks at us. It's not looking for all of our imperfections, but it's looking at us and saying, in the midst of this reality, you are doing the best. How can I be a part of this and help you continue to doing more of that? And so I think even though it's not implicit within my work, a lot of what I do, it's guided by my faith.
Thank you. It's so important to hear because not many of us are going to grow up to be theologians. Maybe some of you will. Or not many of us are going to go into explicit ministry roles. We're going to live in the world and have to allow our faith to animate the work that we do and to bring that into whatever work that you do.